Welcome back to Cheney's War Room. The apex predator of podcasts is currently being broadcast from the mosh pit of a Carnival cruise.
Do it live! I'll write it and we'll do it live!
Hello and welcome to the third episode of Cheney's War Room. And this is a very special episode that marks the beginning of the late Jurassic for this podcast, as we have another Cheney here in the old War Room.
Hey, fellow Cheneys. I'm Nathan Wilk. I've been out of commission for a couple weeks because I had my third heart attack, but I've taken a new heart from an Iraqi child, so I'm back and I'm ready to go.
In terms of other administrative things for this podcast, now having a new co-host, we're still going to be playing around with the format, but hopefully now we can cover more stuff and do more fun things. The working format for this episode, though, just so we can all have a little roadmap, is that we're going to summarize some new stuff that wasn't really big enough for the actual meat of this pod. Then we're going to hit on the main entrees for this week. Both Nathan and I have prepared some stories we want to discuss, and then after that we'll be joined by a friend of mine to talk about rent strikes and homelessness issues. All right, Nathan, shall we do appetizers? Some tasty little news nuggets?
Yep, let's get into the appetizers. Tasty. Boris Johnson just got out of the ICU this week after becoming the first major politician, major world leader to contract the coronavirus. It's good that he's okay for his country, I guess. It's even better that it's now okay to make fun of him again.
I mean, yeah, exactly. He's out of the ICU, for better or worse for Britain. The dude who tried to cut Britain's National Health Service and close hospitals and was still shaking hands the day he went in has dodged consequences once again, which is not to say he deserved it, but, you know. In other news, Trump is trying to reopen the economy by early May. I don't know. Do you have much to say on this, Nathan? We all saw this coming. He's just going to keep moving the goalposts more and more.
Yeah, he said in a press conference today that staying at home leads to a different kind of death, life, as it's also called. But I think this is a really obvious, desperate move. It's not good for the Republican economic model. And it's not good for re-election to have the country under lockdown. And I think the idea of getting the economy reopened would be really good for November for him. But obviously, that can't really be done easily. Definitely not by May. Pretty much no estimates are putting it around there. So do with that what you will.
Yeah, because I don't know. If you're going to try and do the thing where you reopen the economy, you have to send the bipedal humanoids that make the economy go back to work, which will inevitably lead to more deaths because this will not be over by May. So we once again have to make the super hard decision between whether or not we prioritize the stock market or we prioritize human life.
On top of that, surprise news, there have been coronavirus patients recently who, despite already having the disease and recovering, have tested positive again. So the whole recovery model that we're looking at may be a little bit flawed. In other news, Bernie Sanders, progressive candidate and subject of many a meme, has dropped out of the Democratic primary race, leaving Joe Biden as the shoe-in for nominee.
I mean, honestly, a rip to a real one. Once-in-a-lifetime progressive campaign. I was all in, just like everybody else with a functioning brain younger than 40. And I don't know, it's just sad. He ran an aggressive campaign to try and do the most bare-bone things to help the working and lower class, and he got completely shit on for trying to do so. So I guess it was a little naive that a campaign like that could go and persist without them shutting it down. And by them, I mean the entire mass media sphere, the DNC, and every person that has a check mark on Twitter. Bernie's campaign was completely suppressed and all of its winnings and supporters' voices were downplayed or not played at all, but we all knew this was going to happen. And I would say that a lot of political hope is gone especially among like younger folk, now that Biden has to be the presumptive nominee for the presidency.
Definitely. Porter, do you think that that Biden can win?
Oh, I don't know. Coming out of all of this, I don't know. First off, I should preface that anybody does not know anything about politics. So take everything everybody says with a grain of salt. But I don't, from my personal opinion, from where I stand, I don't know if Bernie, or rather if Biden has what Bernie had, nor does he have the advantages that Hillary did in 2016. Like Bernie just in the primary received more individual donations than any campaign in American history. They had a literal volunteer army, thousands of canvassers in every state. I a few months ago back in Iowa, I remember reading about one dude that came from Tokyo to volunteer. In Nevada and Iowa, they averaged like 2 doors knocked on a second. They averaged over 10 million calls a month and sent millions more texts. Biden doesn't really have any of this. He doesn't have an army behind him. And I think for many of the diehard Bernie folk, who are going to be the ones that, who are the ones that volunteered for Bernie, is that they're not going to lift a finger or donate a dime for Biden. Sure, some of them may vote blue no matter who, but you need more than that to win an election. Because at least in 2016, Clinton had a pretty committed base from the start of her campaign. Biden doesn't have a real base. It's a weak amalgamation that was formed last second. I mean, if you remember, he didn't get higher than like 3rd place in the first 3 states and only gained significant support when all of his moderate rivals dropped out in the same 3-day span and endorsed him just to stop Bernie. I mean, I'm going to quote the same statistic I did last episode, where only 24% of Biden supporters are enthusiastic to vote for him. But I don't know. Look, maybe Biden will go and win the nomination and go and win the election. I don't know. After 2016, no one knows anything more about politics. I just know for a fact that from where I see, his base looks very weak. I mean, the real only reason he won Super Tuesday was because of like a crazy turnout of white suburban moderates, and mostly those over 40. But in the general, I would hazard that Trump wins the over 40 white suburban crowds. So I don't know. I mean, Nathan, do you really think he can win all of this?
Well, I don't know. See, the thing with Biden for me is that he has been very good at very successfully, I think, misrepresented his history as a politician. He's been someone who's been terrible on civil rights, who has, rather than as he's kind of claimed, he hasn't really moved Republicans left throughout his political career. He's moved Democrats right. And so he has the support of these people who have seen through him being Obama's president. They've now see him as a champion of civil rights, of kind of moderate, good for the country ideology. And so he has those bases of support. However, I think the people who know about Biden, who know about his history, who know about his sexual assault allegations, are going to have a really hard time, voting when it comes to November for this presidential candidate. And so I don't think he'll have the enthusiasm of the young people, but he does have the name recognition, and that's what's propelled him to the Democratic nomination over Bernie.
Yeah, I mean, as for those who are asking, like, has this happened before, and do we have any, like, historical precedent to go off of? I mean, kind of, but, like, once again, take this with a grain of salt. Well, first off, the closest scenario is, of course, the last time Bernie Sanders ran for president, where he also lost to the moderates and didn't get the nomination. But also, believe it or not, I did some research. I think the most other applicable election season closest to this one and what will happen next was the 1988 election, believe it or not. And that was when the Democratic candidate and the civil rights activist Jesse Jackson ran. And his entire campaign was super similar to Bernie's. He tried to have what he called the Rainbow Coalition of African, Hispanic, Asian, Arab, and Native Americans, of gay and straight people, of mostly working class folk, the entire base that Bernie himself tried to go for. And both Bernie and Jackson won a significant number of that base, or rather, so at least far more than their competition. And both ran on similar platforms like universal healthcare and free college. Both Jackson and Bernie were the race's frontrunners until the same thing happened to both of them. The moderate candidates consolidated and won the nomination. And at least in Jackson's case, because we're not far enough down the timeline to know what happens in Bernie's case, but for Jesse Jackson at least, the moderate who beat him out of the nomination went on to lose in a landslide to the first Bush. So I don't know. But if history is doomed to repeat itself, it will on a slant rhyme.
It's worth noting in that election as well that Joe Biden got in 1988 like last or something. I don't know.
Something
I mean,
around
he's
there.
ran for president 3 times. I think it's more probable that if you pick any election in like the last 5 decades and say Biden ran in it, I think you have a pretty good bet of being right.
I do think though that that Bernie's campaign and the people who backed it failed to acknowledge, I think, the overwhelming majority of the moderate pro perception of electability ideology that drove people to vote for Joe Biden. Bernie Sanders did very well during this chaos when all of the moderates were divided up. Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, Biden, Bloomberg, etc. And once there was kind of the call to all move around that central candidate who was Joe Biden, it came. And so I think that shows the power of the DNC and the power of this idea of, oh, we'll go for whoever is electable, even if they're not our first choice.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think if we're talking about like just DNC raw power behind the scenes, I don't think you need a better example than what happened to Pete Buttigieg. He had massive nationwide support, which was probably pretty unheard of for a random mayor out of South Bend. But especially that he actually won the first state. He didn't win the popular vote, but he won Iowa in terms of points. And then went out to drop out before Super Tuesday and endorse a dude that didn't even win third in any of those states. So that's never happened before. So there is definitely some backroom deals that were made. Okay. I think we're good for the random news bits there. And pour one out for Gramps all the same.
Yeah, on to some lighter news. Prison. So the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has done nothing if not expose all of the fractures and all the frictions of the economies and the cultures and the governments that have been affected hardest by the virus. As the public is told to practice social distancing, there are many struggling to choose between their frontline minimum wage jobs and safety. There are the newly unemployed people whose economic issues aren't going to be solved by DNC senators joining the Yang Gang for 1 month. And beyond that, prisoners in particular have no leverage in this situation. Here, in these facilities located in infected areas, COVID-19 threatens to hit the hardest. It's been known that prisons are hotbeds for infections like tuberculosis. The systems of countries like Italy, Canada, and the United Kingdom have stretched beyond capacity, creating close quarters in which disease spreads easily. The U.S., for those keeping score at home, is just an inch under its capacity, if only because there's so many goddamn prisons in this country. Prison populations have higher rates of conditions like asthma and diabetes than the greater public, which makes them high risk for dangerous illnesses like COVID, and medical care is often inaccessible. In the U.S., prisoners may lose access to prescribed medication or not receive care even after serious injury. These long-standing flaws have not been meaningfully addressed despite all of the documentation. And now they're having real consequences as they spell hospitalization and possible death for inmates and staff members. As New York has become the focus of the U.S. epidemic, the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan has struggled with obtaining necessary resources, lacking both the ability to test and necessary protective gear until at least April 4th, well into the spread. Meanwhile, prisons are quickly drowning in cases. At least 287 in the Rikers Island complex, 60 at Brunners in North Carolina, and countless others across the country and across the world. People have and will continue to die. Prisoners have largely responded in outrage. Across the world, in Colombia, in Italy, and Washington state, riots and prison breaks have resulted from widespread panic, leading to tear gassing, injury, and even killings. The urgency, the desperation of this population cannot be disregarded. Luckily, the federal government has begun to respond. Attorney General Barr has ordered the Federal Bureau of Prisons to, quote, move vulnerable inmates out, end quote, utilizing house arrest as an alternative. One benefactor of these types of policies has been the asthmatic Tekashi 6ix9ine, also known as 6ix9ine, a popular rapper and apparently William Barr's new best friend. In all seriousness, though, The movement of non-essential prisoners into secluded locations is an important step in easing congestion within these facilities, and paired with proper resources can prevent tragedy. The success of social distancing has been shown in states like Oregon, which have flattened the curve and stopped widespread infection. The lesson that this country will have to learn from the current crisis, though, is that the treatment of our prison system at the moment is not sustainable. Countries that have seen extreme consequences of poor prison health care need to have serious discussions about prison reform. If only, here in the U.S. there was a candidate for public office who ran on prison and healthcare reform, some sort of progressive voice or something. Anyways, Porter, tell us more about the architect of mass incarceration and also our Democratic nominee, Joe Biden.
I would love to. But first, I wanted to add something. You talked about Rikers Island in New York, and I was reading an article the other day of which in New York, you actually can be arrested now for failing to social distance, and they will send you to Rikers Island, which is now basically just fully constructed out of smallpox blankets we gave to the natives. So, I mean, Corona in New York is a very harsh irony. Okay, I want to move on to another entree for this week that I'm very excited about. Is that this podcast, James War Room, has new competition. Because you know who else started a pod just after this one was birthed from the depths of Tartarus? Joe Biden himself. And I hate to rail on Biden's pod because I know he is a huge fan of the show. Roll on the clip, please.
First of all, I actually like Dick Cheney for real.
But his pod, unfortunately, isn't very good. And I want to give him some constructive criticism from his fellow podcasting boys that are just out to help him and make it in this difficulty in podcasting world. So I went into Biden's podcast thinking it'll just be a fun collection of him just saying dumb stuff, just complete and utter gaffes, hopefully to rival his old classics like black kids are just as smart as normal kids. But no.
White kids.
He meant to say white kids.
Wait, poor kids are just as smart as white kids. That's it.
Something to that effect, yeah. But no, I was so naive. Biden's podcast is the most manufactured and artificial piece of media I've heard in a long time. It's less of a structured podcast and more like a weekly checkup to confirm that Biden, in fact, is still alive. Firstly, each episode is like 15 to 20 minutes long and is obviously cobbled together from absolute nothing from the cutting room floor. Like, look, at least on this podcast, we aren't audio editing masters here or anything, but we can at least make this pod in a fluid take or make it seem like a fluid take. Every one of Biden's monologues is obviously cut from just multiple takes, and the audio quality is different and his inflections change like his stance on gay marriage. And also, the content of the episodes is just so mind-numbing. There's nothing special or unique. Biden adds nothing to it. The format could have been done with literally anyone else. All it involves is having an expert on and interviewing them, clearly making it so Biden, one, gets to talk less, and you, the listener, also absorb the expert's opinion, and through like mitosis, you go and associate that with Biden's name. Now, while the podcast is boring, and each of the 15-minute episodes is from hours of recording, fun little Biden nuggets still make it through. First, in all of his monologues and over seemingly random dialogue, the most royalty-free music is inserted over it. Here, listen to this.
Hey, Team Biden, it's Joe, and I'm sitting here in Wilmington, Delaware, and it's a scary time. A lot of people out there are confused. Things are changing every day, every hour. So I wanted to have this conversation with you now.
First, okay, after listening to that clip, first, extra points if you caught where they spliced two separate clips of a 10-second opening together. But also, this music is something you would expect to play over a halftime pep show from an Air Bud movie. Also, another worthwhile nugget I enjoyed watching this clip is this one.
You know, for example, I miss my grandkids a lot. I have 5 of them. I FaceTime with them all day. I contact all 5. Probably drives them crazy every day.
And on the surface, that seems pretty innocent, maybe a little boomerish, but it's important to note that Biden actually has 7 grandchildren, not 5. So is there anything to take away from this? Not really. Please don't listen to it. It's not worth it. I did so you don't have to. If there is anything to take away from this, it's just another proof that Biden as a candidate is solely kept alive by his campaign staff. And this is just another weak attempt to make some kind of virtual campaign appearance during Corona. But with Bernie out now, my prediction is that this Biden pod just goes away. If his staffers are smart, they're trying to minimize Biden's public appearances where he has to talk and behave like a human. God, I remember, like 2 weeks ago, they tried the exact same thing. Both Bernie and Biden held fireside chats, FDR style, and the contrast was laughable. Bernie was the most viewed stream on Twitch, which one does show that gamers can't be comrades, and Biden charged $2,800 for a ticket to his. Imagine paying $3K for a Zoom call. Also, I can't believe I forgot to mention this. Biden's podcast.
That's called college, friend.
Also, Biden's podcast is named Here's the Deal. And all I have to say on that is it's really inspiring when the campaign that needs to win over progressives names their podcast a contemptuous phrase that just means, no, better things aren't possible. Shut up. Here's a compromise. That really gets those enthusiasm number pumping. Okay. So that's all good there. And before we move into the actual interview, I do have one last thing I would like to say on Bernie dropping out and voting itself. Because a lot of people, I've seen a lot of things on both Twitter and also my friends asking, like, look, who should I vote for? I don't really want to vote for Biden since he's a rapist. And I don't want to tell you who to vote for per se. It's your right as an American to vote for whoever you want. And if that means looking at third parties, that's your right to do so. I would prefer not to say what I'm doing. And I've heard many arguments and I've personally made my mind up. But I'll just say if you're looking for the third parties and don't want to vote for either of the two rapists, Howie Hawkins with the Green Party is pretty cool. And La Riva with the PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, she also seems pretty cool. And if any of those third parties get at least 5% of the vote, they get federal funding. So you do you. My main thing is just don't let anyone tell you that a vote for not Biden is a vote for Trump. It's your right to vote for how you want and not be held hostage by a dude who was against gay marriage until 2008. Just respond with just go and respond to them with a vote for not Trump is a vote for Biden. Just vote for who you want. I don't care. I don't know. Nathan, do you have much to say on this, or do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think I'm chilling, yeah.
Okay, cool. I think we're all done with this bit of this podcast. So when you hear us again, we will be sitting down and talking to our friend Trinity and talking about rent strikes and what's going to happen now when nobody can pay their rent. And what happens when Corona ravages through America's giant homeless population because we do nothing to care for them. And now we're going to get what we deserve from that. Okay, talk to you all later. All right, welcome back. We are now joined by Trinity Chernoff, where we're going to be talking about the fallout of Corona to both the homelessness population and renters across the country, and the failure of the multiple things our government has done, but specifically the failure in this regard, and how these populations have been the worst hit and will probably further down the line be hit even harder.
Right. So here in Oregon, in Multnomah County, there has been a moratorium placed by Kate Brown on eviction. So rent has largely been deferred. However, this policy does not include rent forgiveness. So what is going to happen when this emergency ends, Trinity? And how will these people who cannot pay their rent currently cope with the coronavirus crisis and built up bills afterwards?
Hi, yeah, so basically all this is going to do is push all these problems to a later date and then pile them on to where they're all due all at once. So all these people who haven't been working for the duration of all these months that the coronavirus has been hitting these populations because they're getting laid off, they're not able to pay rent now. They're not saving up any money for when this rent is going to be due sooner, and they're going to be evicted anyways. And so what we're seeing is that this is really just a bandage on a gunshot wound, or when you save all your homework to the last night before finals or something. So this isn't like something that's going to help, and what would help would be rent forgiveness, like you mentioned, or even just like a complete rent moratorium, and to prevent hurting other aspects of that business per se, it would be also a mortgage moratorium. That would also help.
And I'm looking at an article right now from Market Watch that reported that 1/3 of Americans in April that pay rent didn't pay their rent. And now we expect everything like this is going to get worse. So what do you think will happen when we effectively get to a de facto rent strike where nobody can pay their rent?
I mean, at the end of the day, these people aren't making money because no one's being hired or rehired unless you're an essential worker. And so it's not like they can pay rent. And then people, their first response to, that's going to hurt landlords. But when you think about it, these landlords, they only want these people to pay rent so they can pay their mortgage. So who this is going to actually hurt is the banks. And the thing is the banks aren't people. They're corporations that are already getting bailouts from federal, local government. So at the end of the day, the only corporations that hurt from not paying rent are the banks. So
Interesting.
yeah, basically.
So I guess moving on to the other main issue at hand, which is homelessness. Can you describe kind of what's happening with Mount Scott and the issues with homelessness that are being faced right now in Portland due to coronavirus?
Yeah, I mean, Mount Scott is only one example of this, but I just personally see a huge poverty bias in City Hall. But because they're issuing these things or these statements saying that they're going to allow houseless people to camp at Mount Scott and use the facilities. And this morning, I saw that they've been working on building more shelters and places for people to camp. But when you really think about this, well, yes, it is a good thing per se. Mount Scott resides in a neighborhood that is not necessarily super wealthy. I mean, we're not any Laurelhurst. We don't have a ton of resources at hand. And so the people who live here, a lot of them are renters, and they're people who can't afford the privilege of having their own outdoor space, like a yard to be in and social distance in. So they're forced to go to these parks that are now, I would personally consider a resource, but now they're being taken away for all these people to come camp in. So I'm just seeing how City Hall is corralling all the low income and financially vulnerable people to one area and sector of the city and taking away resources from people who are already financially vulnerable. Honestly, it's like a bandage on a gunshot wound. It's something that's, yes, is helping on the outside, but is not really helping anybody. I mean, the fact is they're giving them a place to pitch a tent. It's not comparable to giving someone a roof over their head.
And while we talked about the roots of this problem, I guess we should ask, seeing the failure in response that many local governments, at least in Oregon, because at least Oregon is doing something. There are many places across this nation where places are just doing nothing at all. But in your opinion, whether this be on a local government scale or on a nationwide scale, I don't know which one you can speak to more, but what should be done? What is the proper course of action here for both homelessness populations and for those renting in the face of Corona?
Well, it is a fair assessment to say that since PDX has like a very unique amount of homeless people living in city borders, that I think it would be a fair assessment to say that we should be reacting to this per the context of what's happening here on a local scale. But I also think that like federally, there should be some blanket statements and blanket actions being taken to help solve some of these issues where a federal rent and a mortgage moratorium should be put in place, honestly, in my opinion. But I think these things should also be happening on a local scale. So
what about, there are all these empty buildings now that have been built up through various closures, etc. Can't we just move people into like unoccupied hotels, stuff like that? Why aren't we doing that currently?
So currently PDX, what they're doing is moving people who are experiencing houselessness and also positive for coronavirus into empty hotel rooms. However, I honestly don't a reason why we shouldn't be moving all houseless people off the street and into empty hotel rooms. In fact, the governor just closed schools for the rest of the year. And so we have all these school buildings that are going to have to be cleaned anyways, totally empty. A lot of people are working from home, so there's a ton of office spaces that are downtown already that aren't being used. And honestly, I don't really see a reason why we aren't using those spaces. And it's also worthwhile to mention that even before this pandemic, we had enough real estate to house the entire houseless population. Like several times over again, and we're not using that because it's gridlocked in this business end of things where people are forced to pay for their real estate.
Well, I guess that's the end of our specific questions. I should just ask, is there anything else you want to specifically add about this issue or things related to it that we have not asked you?
Yeah, I mean, specifically, I just think that there's a huge poverty bias in City Hall, whether they're doing quote unquote good things or not. I think they really need to prioritize the people right now, and their first priority should be getting everybody a place to shelter in place and stay home. In fact, I think honestly, even the wording of stay home, stay safe is kind of offensive when they're not giving people places to stay home at. So I think that needs to be something that's fixed in City Hall right now.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this and educating us and telling us about how just broken our system is in relating to the lowest class and those that have been destroyed by society and will continue to be ravaged by not only society systems, but also coronavirus and all this, which really does show all the failure of all the systems and everything that happens in our society. So I guess, Trinity, is there anything you would like to plug or promote near the end of the interview?
First of all, I'd like to promote, I guess my Twitter. You can find me at Trinity Chernoff on Twitter. Also, just making sure you're registered to vote so you can vote in these local elections right now. I know a lot of people are disenfranchised because of how Bernie suspended his campaign, but whether you're voting in the presidential primary or not, you should still be taking an active part in voting for local elections. I know Next Up is a great organization and resource for young people to get registered to vote. I got registered to vote through them, so I'm pretty sure you can register online.
Yeah, you can. So, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Trinity.
And that's episode 3 of Cheney's War Room. Tune in next week when we're interviewing the reanimated corpse of Ronald Reagan, who says trickle-down economics still works in the underworld. I'm Nathan Wilk. You can find my podcast, Faces with Nathan Wilk, on SoundCloud or YouTube.
And I'm Porter Wheeler. You can find me on Twitter as just Porter Wheeler or at Doc Baddington, and Instagram as at Porter Wheeler. And you can find me at row 27 seat B on JetBlue flight 441 to Cincinnati. Talk to you all next week.